In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one sound no human language has a word for. The sound a Death World's canopy makes when it bites down on 4,000 tons of Imperial transport. Wet. Like a mouth the size of a continent closing, teeth made of wood and root, and things growing since before the Emperor walked among men. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Orbeck Traves, stowage-master aboard the Meriddan's Oath, a man whose entire job was making sure a grain hauler didn't kill itself with its own cargo. 4 years, not a single load lost. Then he fell out of the sky onto Vekharra and learned what the forest had already done to people long before he arrived. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. When the Meriddan's Oath hit the canopy of Vekharra, the sound it made was something no human language has a word for. It was wet, like the planet had opened a mouth the size of a continent and bitten down on 4,000 tons of Imperial bulk transport, and the teeth were made of wood and root and things that had been growing since before the Emperor walked among men. I was in Cargo Bay 7, wedged between 2 securing struts with my arms wrapped around a junction pipe, and the world turned sideways, then upside down, then into a direction that doesn't exist. The hull screamed, the lumens burst, and something warm and heavy that used to be a man hit me in the dark, and for a while I stopped knowing anything at all. My name is Orbeck Traves. I was stowage-master aboard the Meriddan's Oath, a Goliath-class grain hauler on a routine nutrient base run from the agri-world, Tessek 7 to Hive World Morcane. My job, in terms a child could understand, was making sure the ship didn't kill itself with its own cargo. Weight distribution across 900 cargo bays, load balancing during warp translation, making sure the aft holds didn't shift and turn 40,000 tons of compressed nutrient paste into a battering ram that would punch through the engine block. It's not a glamorous job. Nobody writes ballads about the man who correctly calculated a center of mass variance. But I was good at it, and I'd been doing it for 4 years without losing a single load, which in the bulk transport trade makes you something close to a miracle worker. 4 years. 26 Terran Standard. I had a bunk with a privacy curtain and a ration card that got me an extra protein wafer on feast days, and I thought I was doing well for myself. That was before I learned what Vekharra was, and what it does to people, and what it had already done to people long before we ever fell out of the sky. Let me tell you what they don't put in the training manuals about a crash landing on a death world. They don't tell you about the silence. After the impact, after the shrieking metal and the detonations and the screaming, there is a moment where everything stops. The wreck settles. The fires don't start yet, or they do, but you can't hear them. The planet holds its breath and you hold yours, and for one heartbeat you think it might be over. Then the canopy starts to move. You can hear it through the hull, even through meters of ceramite plating and structural reinforcement. A sound like a million fingers drumming. That's the vegetation reclaiming what you just broke. On a normal world, a crashed ship would sit in its crater for centuries. On Vekharra, the forest was already threading roots through the hull breaches before the engine fires had burned out. I woke up in total darkness with a dead man across my legs and something sharp in my left shoulder. Blood, but not a lot. I could move my hands, my feet, my neck. The dead man was one of my cargo handlers, a big quiet fellow named Stent, who'd been hauling securing chains when the impact hit. He didn't have a head anymore. Not in the sense that it had been removed cleanly, but in the sense that the space where his head should have been was now occupied by a structural beam that had come through the wall. I pushed him off me, which took more effort than it should have because he was a large man, and because the floor was tilted at roughly 30 degrees, and everything was covered in a substance that I eventually realized was nutrient paste. Thousands of tons of the stuff had broken containment across the lower decks. It was everywhere, knee-deep in places, already going rancid in the heat. Heat, that's the other thing they don't prepare you for. The Meriddan's oath had been a comfortable 6 degrees Celsius in the cargo bays, regulated by environmental systems that were now scattered across several kilometers of alien forest. The air coming through the hull breaches was something else entirely. Hot, thick, wet in a way that made you feel like you were breathing through a soaked rag. And it tasted wrong. Not poisonous, not immediately, but there was something in that air that told every cell in your body this was not a place you belonged. I found my way to the main cargo corridor by following the sound of voices. Not many voices. In the dark, through flooded passages and collapsed sections and the ever-present slick of liquefied nutrient paste, I crawled and climbed and dragged myself toward the people who were still alive. It took me what felt like hours. When I finally reached a section where the emergency lumens still worked, the red glow showed me a corridor full of people sitting against the walls, covered in paste and blood, and expressions that had given up on processing what had happened. I counted 19. Later, when we broke through to the upper decks and connected with other survivor groups, that number would climb to 143. The Meriddan's oath had carried a complement of 2,381 souls. Warrant Lieutenant Jareth Helvane found me before I found him. He was the ranking naval armsman aboard, a lean man with a regulation scar across his jaw, and the kind of eyes that looked like they'd been issued by the Departamento Munitorum along with his uniform. Calm. Not the reassuring calm of someone who had the situation under control, but the flat calm of someone who had already accepted that no one did. He was standing at the junction of two corridors with a las pistol on his hip and paste up to his shins, directing survivors toward the upper hull sections where there was light and air that hadn't been recycled through burning insulation. When he saw me, he said 3 words. "Your cargo." I said yes. He said, "Good. You're going to count everything we have and tell me how long we can survive on it." That was how I became important on Vekharra. Not because of anything heroic, because I could count. It took us 3 days to consolidate the survivors and take stock of what we had. In those 3 days, we learned several things about Vekharra that the Imperium's planetary survey data, had we been able to access any, would have told us in advance. The atmosphere was breathable, but carried biological particulates that caused headaches, nosebleeds, and a persistent ringing in the ears that never entirely went away. The temperature was a constant 38 degrees Celsius with humidity so high that metal began to corrode within hours of exposure. The planet's electromagnetic field played havoc with Vox equipment, reducing our communication range to about 50 meters on a good day, which meant that coordinating groups across the wreck site required runners. Human beings running back and forth through an alien forest, carrying messages by mouth. There's a word for that level of technology. I believe the word is ancient, and the forest itself. I need to talk about the forest. Imagine every tree you've ever seen. Now imagine it's alive. Not alive in the way trees are alive, growing and photosynthesizing and standing there being wooden. Alive in the way an animal is alive. Reactive, aware, hungry. Vekharra's dominant vegetation was a fungal arboreal hybrid, which is a fancy way of saying the trees were mushrooms the size of hab blocks, and they didn't like us. Their trunks were a dense, fibrous material that oozed a luminescent fluid when cut, and their canopy was a web of interlocking filaments that filtered the sunlight into a perpetual blue-green twilight. Beautiful, if you could forget that the filaments moved. Not with the wind. There was rarely wind under the canopy. They moved on their own, slowly, constantly, reaching for things that got too close. They weren't fast enough to catch a walking man, but if you stood still for 10 minutes, you'd find them threading through your hair, your clothing, the gaps in your boots. One of the survivors fell asleep against a trunk on the second night. By morning, the filaments had grown through both of his ears and into his nasal cavity. He was still alive when we cut him loose. Chirurgeon Esilt Nurem, the ship's senior medicee, who'd survived with a broken collarbone and a disposition that made Helvane look cheerful, spent an hour extracting fiber from his sinuses with a pair of tweezers and a vocabulary that would have made a drill abbot blush. That was day 2. On day 3, we met the fauna. The first creature to find us was about the size of a cargo servitor and roughly the same shape. If cargo servitors were covered in overlapping chitinous plates the color of bruised meat and had 6 legs that ended in hooked claws. It came out of the canopy above us, dropped onto one of the perimeter guards that Helvane had posted around the crash site, and pulled him apart in the time it took me to open my mouth. Not a figure of speech. It literally dismantled him limb from limb, with the mechanical efficiency of a Factorum disassembly line. By the time the other guards opened fire with their lasguns, it had taken what it wanted, which appeared to be the man's abdominal organs, and retreated back up the trunk of the nearest fungal tree with a speed that something that large had no right to possess. Helvane put 3 lass bolts into it as it climbed. They scorched its plates but didn't penetrate. The thing didn't even flinch. It just kept climbing, carrying a man's insides in its forward claws, and vanished into the canopy where the luminescent glow swallowed it whole. We called them renders, not an official designation, not an administratum-approved taxonomic classification, just what you call a thing that renders people into component parts. There were other creatures, too. Smaller ones that hunted in packs, quick-moving things with too many eyes and mandibles that injected a paralytic venom. Burrowing organisms that came up through the soft ground at night and chewed through boot leather, skin, muscle, and bone with equal indifference. Flying things that weren't quite insects and weren't quite birds. Traveling in clouds of thousands, each one no bigger than a fingernail, but equipped with a proboscis that could punch through cloth and draw blood. They weren't individually dangerous, but a cloud of them could drain a grown man in minutes if he couldn't get to cover. We lost 2 people to the swarms before Nurem figured out that the smoke from burning nutrient paste repelled them. After that, we kept fires burning at all times, and the crash site took on the perpetual smell of scorched synthetic protein. Not pleasant, but better than being drunk alive by a billion tiny needles. I did my job. I counted. 143 survivors, of whom 11 were too badly injured to move. 61 lasguns with varying charge levels. 23 naval pistols, 1 multi-laser that had been ripped from its mounting, and was technically functional but weighed more than most people could carry. The Departamento Munitorum would have called it infantry portable, but the Departamento Munitorum has a generous definition of infantry. Food supplies for approximately 40 days if rationed to starvation levels. Most of it the same nutrient paste that was already coating everything. Water was not an immediate problem because the humidity meant condensation formed on every metal surface, and we could collect it in containers. But Nurem warned us that prolonged consumption of water contaminated with local biological particulates would have consequences she couldn't predict. 19 sets of basic tools, 3 medici kits, one of them crushed beyond use, 2 functional Vox casters with a range of, as mentioned, about 50 meters, 1 astropath. The astropath deserves his own mention. His name was Volkhast, and he'd been aboard the Meriddan's Oath because even grain haulers require a sanctioned psyker to send and receive astrotelepathic communications during long warp transits. Volkhast was old, thin, blind in the way all astropaths are blind, and he had survived the crash without a scratch on him. Not a bruise, not a cut, not a single broken bone. 2,238 people had died around him, and he sat in the wreckage without a mark. When I asked him how, he simply said, "I was warned." I didn't ask by whom. At the time, I assumed he meant the Emperor, or the Warp, or one of the 1,000 cryptic things astropaths say, instead of answering. It was only later, after I understood what Vekharra was and what it had been doing to his mind since before we struck the canopy, that I wondered whether the thing that warned him was the same thing that eventually killed him. You don't ask astropaths questions like that unless you want answers that make your teeth ache. What mattered was that he was alive. He was functional, and in theory he could cast a distress call into the warp that another astropath somewhere might catch and relay onward. In theory. In practice, Volkhast told us that something about Vekharra's biosphere interfered with his abilities. He described it as trying to speak through a wall of whispers. The planet's living systems generated a low-level psychic background noise that drowned out his transmissions like static drowns out a whisper. He would keep trying, he said. I believed he meant it. I did not believe he would succeed. Helvane established a command structure within the first 48 hours, himself at the top, obviously. Below him, Bosun Kressel, a thick-necked career deckhand who'd been maintaining discipline on the lower crew decks for 15 years and had the scarred knuckles to prove it. Then the surviving armsmen, such as they were, 8 of them, each assigned a section of the perimeter. Then what Helvane called essential personnel, which included Nurem, Enginseer Gamis Ro Delvex, who had emerged from the enginarium with half his augmetics sparking and a chunk of bulkhead embedded in his left shoulder, and me, the rest of the survivors, roughly 120 souls consisting of ratings, cargo handlers, menials, and a handful of indentured laborers from the lower decks, were organized into work details. Clearing wreckage, fortifying the perimeter, salvaging anything useful from the rapidly deteriorating hull sections. Everyone had a job. Everyone ate the same ration of nutrient paste twice a day. Everyone slept in the same converted cargo bay that we'd managed to seal and reinforce against the forest's constant encroachment. It was, I will admit, an impressive display of Imperial discipline. Helvane was not a kind man, but he was a competent one, and in those first days, competence mattered more than kindness. He made decisions quickly, he communicated them clearly, and when a group of lower-deck laborers refused a work assignment on the second day, he had Kressel break the ringleader's arm in front of the others, and that was the end of the discussion. I did not approve. I also did not object. Vekharra was not a place for committee meetings. What I did was manage the supplies, track the losses, and try to figure out how long we could hold out. The answer, which I gave to Helvane on the evening of the 4th day, was not encouraging. At current consumption rates, with a population that was shrinking daily due to creature attacks and injuries, and one case of what Nurem called fungal respiratory invasion, which was exactly as horrible as it sounds, we had food for 35 days, water for as long as it rained, which so far had been every afternoon in torrential downpours that turned the crash site into a mud field and carried a mildly acidic pH that etched patterns into exposed metal. Medical supplies for perhaps 2 weeks of serious injuries. Power cells for the lasguns, our primary defense, for approximately 60 days of moderate use, 35 days of food, 60 days of ammunition. I have delivered more encouraging reports in my career, though admittedly not many. The mathematics of survival on a death world, expressed in the only language I trusted. A supply manifest with a deficit that couldn't be closed. Helvane received this report with the same flat expression he received everything. Then he said, "Can we eat anything local?" I told him I was a stowage-master, not a xenobiologist. He told me to find out. So, on the 5th day on Vekharra, I added, determining whether the alien ecosystem that was actively trying to devour us was itself edible, to my list of responsibilities. Nurem helped in the sense that she provided me with the Medicae kit's chemical analysis tools and a list of compounds that would kill a human being and told me not to eat anything until she'd tested it first. The results were not encouraging. Of the 14 samples I collected from within the perimeter over the next 2 days, 11 were toxic, 2 caused violent hallucinations in the unfortunate rating who volunteered to test them, and 1 was technically non-poisonous but had a texture and taste that one of the test subjects described as chewing on a dead man's tongue. We ate it anyway. You eat what there is. By the end of the first week, we had lost 21 people. 11 in the crash, found dead as we explored the wreck. 4 to creature attacks, 2 to the fungal respiratory condition which Nurem had begun calling root lung, and which involved the planet's omnipresent spores colonizing the bronchial passages and slowly converting lung tissue into something that was no longer lung tissue. 1 to a fall from the upper hull during salvage operations. 1 to suicide, a young rating who walked into the forest on the 3rd night and was found the next morning, or what the renders had left of him. And 2 to what I can only describe as the forest itself. They were working at the perimeter, cutting back the growth that pressed against our barricades every night, and the ground opened beneath them. Not a sinkhole, not an animal burrow. The root network beneath the surface simply parted like a mouth and closed again with them inside it. We could hear them screaming for almost a minute before it stopped. 122 survivors, end of week 1. I updated the manifest. I adjusted the ratios. I did my job. Gamis Rho Delvex had been quiet through all of this. The engineer had set up a workspace in what remained of the ship's secondary cogitator chamber, a cramped space deep in the wreck where the hull was still mostly intact and the forest hadn't yet penetrated. He'd been there since the 2nd day, surrounded by salvaged data cores and jury-rigged power units, working with a focus that bordered on obsession. Nurem had tried to examine his injuries on the 1st day, and he'd refused her outright, pulling away when she reached for the clasps of his outer robe with a speed that startled her. "My systems are self-repairing," he'd said, which was a lie that Nurem accepted only because she had 140 other patients who weren't refusing care. When I brought him his ration on the 6th day, he was connected to a cogitator bank via a spool of wire plugged directly into the socket at the base of his skull, his remaining organic eye closed, his augmetic one flickering with data scroll. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't acknowledge anyone. I noticed which data cores he'd prioritized in his salvage. Not the environmental systems that might have told us about Vekharra's atmosphere. Not the engineering banks that might have helped us repair the ship. The navigational archives. The secure communication logs. The kind of data that tells you where a ship has been and why. At the time, I assumed he was trying to piece together what had gone wrong with our transit. A reasonable assumption. A wrong one. I left his paste on a flat surface and went back to counting the living. By the end of the second week, I had begun to notice something. The creature attacks were changing. Not in frequency. They came every 2 or 3 days, always at night, always from the canopy. But in method. The first render attack had been straightforward, a single large predator making an opportunistic kill. The second attack, 3 days later, involved 2 renders approaching from different directions simultaneously. The third attack, on day 9, involved 4 of them, and they didn't come from the canopy. They came from the root network, erupting from the ground at the weakest point in our perimeter, the section where the hull plating was thinnest. They killed 3 people and dragged the bodies underground before we could mount a response. I mentioned this to Helvane. He said, "They're learning." I said that was not a comforting observation. He said comfort was not his department. Fair enough. Nurum had a theory. She'd been examining render tissue from a claw that had broken off during the third attack, and she told me that the creature's nervous system was not self-contained. It was connected through a network of chemical and electrical signals to the fungal root system beneath the ground, the same root system that made up most of the forest floor, the same root system that had swallowed 2 of our people whole. The trees and the animals aren't separate organisms, she said, cleaning render chitin from under her fingernails with a scalpel. They're the same system. The forest is the predator. The renders are just its teeth. And we were inside it. Not on its surface. Inside it. The ship had punched through the canopy and buried itself in the system's body, and everything since, every attack, every death, every night, the growth pushed harder against the barricades. Was the system working on a splinter it wanted out? That thought kept me awake for 2 nights straight, which on Vekharra was particularly unfortunate because the things that came in the dark were getting bolder. The third week on Vekharra was when things started to come apart. Not because of the planet, although the planet certainly helped. Because of us. The food situation was the spark. My calculations had been optimistic, as it turned out, because I'd underestimated how much nutrient paste would be lost to spoilage. The local microorganisms were eating it almost as fast as we were. The paste that had flooded the lower decks had turned into a stinking, bioluminescent sludge within 10 days, colonized by Vekharra's ever-present fungal spores, and converted into something that was no longer food by any definition. Our sealed reserves were holding, but they were finite, and the daily ration had to be cut twice in the first 3 weeks. The second cut, which took us from survival portions to what Nurum clinically described as slow starvation rations, was the one that broke the peace. The lower deck laborers had been holding together under Cressel's iron supervision, but hunger erodes obedience the way Vekharra's rain eroded metal. A group of about 30 of them, led by a cargo handler named Fenevar, confronted Helvane at the morning muster on day 18. Their complaint was simple and not unreasonable. The armsmen, who were doing perimeter duty and therefore burning more calories, were receiving the same ration as the laborers who were doing heavy salvage work. Fenevar wanted equal portions adjusted by workload. Helvane refused. Not because the request was wrong, but because adjusting rations for one group meant opening negotiations with every group, and once you start negotiating survival, you've already lost control of it. Fennevar pushed back. Kressel stepped in. It got physical. When it was over, Fennevar had a dislocated shoulder, and two of his people had lash burns on their arms from warning shots that were aimed a little too close to be warnings. After that, the lower deck laborers stopped cooperating voluntarily. They did their work because there were men with guns standing over them, and they did it slowly, badly, and with a look in their eyes that I recognized from the cargo holds of every ship I'd ever served on. The look of people who have been counted and found expendable. I knew that look because I'd worn it myself early in my career, before my skills made me marginally more valuable alive than dead. I will say this for Helvain, he did not enjoy it. Some officers relish authority the way a carnivore relishes meat. Helvain carried his like a man carrying a heavy load up a hill, not because he wanted to, but because no one else would. When the confrontation was over, I saw him standing alone at the edge of the perimeter, staring into the forest with his hands clasped behind his back, and the set of his shoulders told me everything his face would never show. He was tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. We lost people steadily through the third week. 2 to a render attack on day 16, the largest yet, 6 creatures coordinating a 3-pronged assault on the western barricade, 1 to Rootlung, which by now had claimed 4 victims total. Nurum was treating it with a fungicidal compound she'd synthesized from the Medikey kit's supplies. But she warned me privately that the compound was running low and she wasn't sure it was actually curing anything so much as slowing the progression. And we lost 1 to the forest in a way I haven't described yet because I'm still not entirely sure what happened. His name was Orette, a young voidsman who'd been assigned to the salvage detail working on the ship's outer hull. He was on the upper surface of the wreck, cutting away a section of damaged plating, when the salvage team reported that he simply stopped moving. He was standing on the hull with his cutting tool in his hand, staring at the forest canopy, and he would not respond to shouts or physical contact. When they turned him around, his eyes were open but focused on nothing. His pupils had dilated so far that his irises were invisible. He was breathing, his heart was beating, but the person inside was gone. Nurum examined him and found nothing physically wrong. No toxins, no injuries, no fungal contamination beyond the baseline level we were all carrying by then. Orette lay in the Medikey Bay for 4 days, breathing and blinking and consuming water when it was poured into his mouth. And then on the 5th day he stood up, walked to the perimeter, stepped over the barricade, and walked into the forest without a word. The guards called after him. He didn't turn. He walked in a straight line, perfectly calm, perfectly steady, and the forest closed behind him like water filling a footprint. Nurum had no explanation. Helvain ordered that no one work alone on the outer hull again. I added Orette to the dead column in my manifest and tried not to think about the planet reaching into a man's skull and switching him off like a faulty lumen. It was during the 4th week that I began to find things in the forest. Helvain had authorized limited scouting expeditions to map the terrain around the crash site and locate potential resources. Fresh water sources that weren't contaminated, mineral deposits that might be useful, anything edible that wouldn't poison us. I volunteered for the scouting details, not because I was brave, but because the crash site was becoming a place I couldn't stand to be. The air inside the sealed sections was thick with the smell of rot and unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweetness of the paste sludge, and the atmosphere of simmering resentment between the laborers and the armsmen was its own kind of toxin. At least in the forest, the things trying to kill you were honest about it. The scouting teams went out in groups of 4, armed with lasguns and the chemical repellent that Nurum had developed to keep the smaller organisms at bay. We moved slowly, marking our trail with cuts in the fungal trunks, which bled luminescent fluid that glowed for hours, leaving a breadcrumb path back to camp. We mapped a radius of about 3 kilometers around the wreck in the first few days, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that 3 kilometers of Vekharra is more exhausting than 30 kilometers of open ground. The terrain was a labyrinth of root systems, fungal growths, boggy depressions filled with standing liquid that might be water and might be digestive acid, and the constant oppressive twilight of the canopy that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Compasses didn't work. The electromagnetic interference saw to that. We navigated by the glow of our trail markers and the general direction of the wreck's surviving energy signatures, which Gammis Rho Delvex had managed to boost into a locatable beacon. Navigation by luminescent tree sap and the distant hum of a dying ship. I'm sure the Departamento Cartographica would have had objections, but the Departamento Cartographica wasn't here, which I considered the only advantage Vekharra had offered so far. On the third scouting expedition, about 2.5 kilometers northeast of the crash site, I found a stone. Not a naturally occurring stone, a worked stone, cut into a rectangular block roughly the size of a man's torso, with smooth faces and squared edges that no natural process could have produced. It was half buried in the root network, overgrown with fungal filaments, and it had clearly been there for a very long time, but it was unmistakably artificial. I knelt beside it and scraped away the growth with my knife, and underneath the fungal coating I found markings. Not any language I recognized, geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines radiating outward in precise mathematical intervals. The kind of marks that an engine seer might recognize, but which meant nothing to me except that someone had been here before. Someone had stood on this exact spot and placed this stone and carved these patterns into it, and then the forest had swallowed them the way it was trying to swallow us. I reported the find to Helvane. He sent a team to investigate, and they found more. A line of cut stones running roughly north-south, spaced at regular intervals, disappearing into the undergrowth in both directions. Some kind of road marker, some kind of path. Following it north, the team found the remains of what might have been a structure. Not much. A foundation outline, stone blocks arranged in a rough rectangle, everything above ground level, long since consumed by the forest. But in the center of the foundation, embedded in the root network like a fossil in sedimentary rock, they found metal. Corroded, ancient, but recognizable. A gear, a cogwheel, stamped with a symbol that every citizen of the Imperium would recognize, even in their sleep. The skull and cog of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Gammis Rho Delvex came to see it personally. It was the first time he'd left his cogitator den since the crash, and the sight of him emerging into the twilight of the forest was unsettling in its own right. The chunk of bulkhead was still embedded in his shoulder, the flesh around it having gone gray and necrotic because he had refused to let Nurum remove it, claiming that the metal had fused with his augmetic infrastructure, and removing it might cause cascade failures. Half his face was covered in a web of fine fungal filaments that had colonized his exposed augmetics, giving him the appearance of a machine that was being slowly consumed by the forest. Which, I suppose, he was. We all were. But Gammis wore it differently than the rest of us. He didn't seem to mind. And there was something else I noticed as he picked his way through the undergrowth to the excavation site. The damage to his leg augmetics should have made him stumble on this terrain. Everyone else did. But Gammis moved through the root network with a fluidity that didn't match his injuries. as though his body had capacities his visible hardware didn't account for. I filed it away. You work long enough with heavy machinery and you learn to notice when something is rated for more than its label says. He examined the cogwheel in silence for a long time. His augmetic eye cycled through several spectral modes, casting the scene in different colors as he scanned. Then he said something in lingua technis that I didn't understand. I asked him what it meant. He turned to me with an expression that, on a face with fewer augmetic components, might have been excitement. "This facility," he said in the flat, effect-modulated tone of a man whose vocal cords had been partially replaced with a Vox synthesizer, "is from Explorator Fleet Row Tessera 114. Last recorded activity, approximately 300 Terran Standard years ago. The fleet was dispatched to survey mineral deposits in this region of the segmentum, and was officially listed as lost with all hands." He paused. Officially. He'd identified the fleet designation in seconds. A 3-century-old cogwheel, half consumed by fungal growth, and he'd read it the way I'd read a cargo manifest. I've worked around tech priests for 4 years. They don't identify things that fast unless they already know what they're looking at. I asked him what he meant by officially. He said, "It means someone lied." Over the next several days, the scouting teams followed the stone markers in both directions and mapped a network of ruined structures spread across several square kilometers of forest. Foundations, collapsed walls, the remnants of what might have been landing pads, storage facilities, accommodation blocks. All of it ancient, all of it consumed by the forest, but unmistakably the remains of a Mechanicus outpost. A substantial one. Not a temporary survey camp, but a permanent installation built to last, with infrastructure that suggested a long-term operational presence. Gammis estimated, based on the scale of the ruins and the standard configuration of Mechanicus explorator installations, that the facility had housed at least 300 personnel and had been operational for a decade or more. 300 people, a functioning outpost, and then nothing. No records, no retrieval, no mention in any database that Gammis could access from the Meriddan's Oath's data cores. As far as the Imperium was concerned, Explorator Fleet Row Tessera 114 had jumped into the warp and never come out. Whatever had happened on Vekharra, whoever had lived and worked and presumably died in these ruins, had been erased from the records with the thoroughness that only the Adeptus Mechanicus could manage. I asked Gammis why the Mechanicus would erase a survey outpost from its own records. He said, "There are only 2 reasons the Omnissiah servants erase data. The first is that the data is heretical. The second is that the data is valuable enough to kill for." I mentioned 2 things to Helvane that evening. The first was the Mechanicus ruins and the erased records. The second was something I'd been sitting on since the 6th day. That Gammis had spent every waking hour in the navigational archives, not the engineering or environmental banks. That he'd identified a 300-year-old fleet designation in seconds flat. That he moved better than his injuries should allow. Helvane listened with his usual flat expression, but I saw his eyes change when I mentioned the navigation data. He didn't say anything. He filed it the way I file load discrepancies, something to check when the time comes. It was on the 26th day that we found the skull. Not a human skull, not an animal skull. Something in between. It was sitting on a shelf of root in a clearing about 4 kilometers from the crash site, placed there with obvious deliberation, facing east toward the densest part of the forest. A humanoid skull, roughly human-sized, but with modifications. The bone structure around the eyes had been altered, the sockets widened and deepened. The jaw had been reinforced with what looked like bone grafts from something non-human, and the teeth were wrong. Not human teeth, not entirely. They were wider, flatter, with serrated edges, the kind of dentition you'd expect in something that ate raw meat and tough vegetable matter and didn't bother cooking either. But the skull was human in origin. Nurem confirmed it. Human bone, human structure, human proportions under all the modifications. A human being whose skull had been reshaped, either by surgery or by something slower and more thorough, into something adapted for a very different environment. There were more. Once we knew what to look for, we found them throughout the forest in a rough circle around the ruins. Dozens of them. Skulls on root shelves, skulls wedged into the crooks of fungal trunks, skulls half buried in the forest floor. All modified. All placed with deliberate care, facing inward toward the center of what had once been the Mechanicus installation. Markers, warnings, territorial boundaries. The forest around us had been quiet for 2 days. No render attacks, no swarm incursions, no burrowing things at night, as if the planet's ecosystem had pulled back to watch. I didn't like it. Silence on a death world is never peace. It's a breath drawn before a scream. On the 28th night they came. Not renders, not the forest's usual assortment of creatures that wanted to eat, sting, infect, or absorb us. People, humans, or things that had once been humans and were now something a few steps past. The first we knew of them was when the perimeter guards on the eastern barricade reported movement. Not from the canopy, not from underground, but at ground level, walking upright, bipedal, human-shaped silhouettes moving between the fungal trunks at the edge of the lumen light. The guards issued challenges. No response. They activated their lumen packs and swept the tree line, and what the light revealed was enough to make a man who'd already survived 4 weeks on a death world take an involuntary step backward. They were human, roughly. The same basic shape, the same bipedal stance, the same number of limbs. But the skin was wrong. Not skin-colored, not any human shade, but a mottled gray-green that shifted and rippled in the light like something alive. Their eyes were enormous, adapted for the perpetual twilight under the canopy, with pupils that reflected the lumen light with an amber glow like animal eyeshine. Their mouths were wide, too wide for a human face, and when the nearest one opened its mouth in what might have been a greeting or a threat, the teeth inside were the same serrated, flattened adaptation we'd seen in the skulls. They wore no clothing. They didn't need to. Their skin was thick enough to serve as armor, and fungal filaments grew from their scalps and shoulders and along their spines, integrated into their bodies the way augmetics were integrated into Gammus Rho Delvex. Not worn, grown. There were about 40 of them visible in the tree line, and I had no doubt there were more in the forest behind them. They carried tools that might have been weapons, sharpened lengths of the dense fungal wood, tipped with what looked like render claws lashed in place with fibrous cord. They stood at the edge of our lumen light in absolute silence, and their amber eyes watched us with an intelligence that was unmistakably, terrifyingly human. One of them, smaller than the rest, with fewer growths and skin that hadn't fully shifted to gray, kept glancing between us and the tall one at their center, the way a young soldier watches a sergeant waiting to be told what the thing in front of him is. Not all of them had been born to this. Some were closer to the surface of what they'd once been than others. For a long moment, nobody on either side moved. Then one of them, taller than the others, with a crown of fungal growths sprouting from her skull like a twisted halo, stepped forward. She was female, or had been, the underlying bone structure still recognizable beneath the adaptations. She stopped 3 meters from the barricade, close enough that I could see the fine tracery of luminescent veins running beneath her translucent skin, pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat that seemed too slow for a human being. She looked at Helvane. She looked at the lasguns pointed at her. She looked at the wreck of the Meriddan's oath behind us, the gutted carcass of the ship we'd been hiding in for a month. Then she spoke. In Gothic, accented, distorted by a mouth that was no longer quite shaped for human language, but unmistakably Low Gothic, the same pigeon trade tongue spoken in every port and hive and cargo hold in the Imperium. "You are new," she said. "The forest brought you to us." And somewhere behind me, in the silence that followed, I heard Gammus Rho Delvex make a sound that I had never heard a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus make before. A sound that, if it had come from a fully organic throat, I would have called laughter. The tall one's name was Vetha. Not a human name, not any name from any world I'd ever visited. And when she said it, the way her modified mouth shaped the syllables made it sound less like a word and more like the noise a branch makes when it breaks. But that was what she called herself, and the others deferred to her with a reverence that went beyond simple leadership. They didn't just follow her. They oriented toward her the way plants orient toward light. When she moved, they adjusted. When she spoke, they stilled. Helvane wanted to shoot them. I could see it in the way his hand rested on his last pistol, in the way his jaw worked beneath his regulation scar. To him, they were abhuman at best, mutant at worst, and the Imperial position on unregistered mutant populations is not ambiguous. But he was also a pragmatist, and pragmatism told him that 40 armed figures who could move through Vekharra's forest without being eaten represented either a significant threat or a significant resource, and he couldn't afford to miscalculate which. So instead of shooting, he talked. Or rather, he asked questions in a clipped military cadence, and Vetha answered them in her strange, distorted Gothic, and I stood behind him and listened and felt the hairs on my arms rise and refused to lie back down. They called themselves the Rooted. Approximately 200 of them, living in the deep forest about 6 kilometers northeast of our crash site, in a settlement they called the Overgrowth. They had been there, by Vetha's account, for longer than anyone could remember. She used the phrase, "since the metal ones left," which, given the Mechanicus ruins, suggested a timeline of roughly 3 centuries. 300 years of living on a death world. 300 years of adaptation, generation after generation, each one moving further from the baseline human template and closer to whatever Vekharra needed them to be. Vetha was their leader, their matriarch, what the others called her in a dialect of Gothic that had drifted so far from standard that I could only catch every third word, translated roughly to something between eldest mother and deepest root. She had held the position for what she described as many turnings of the wet season, which could have been 10 years or 50. Time, I would learn, worked differently for the Rooted. They did not count days, they counted cycles. Wet and dry, light and dark, growth and rest. Their calendar was biological, measured in the rhythms of the forest, and it had no room for Terran standards. Helvane asked how they survived. Vetha's answer was simple. "We ate what the forest gave. We became what the forest needed." She said it without pride or horror, the way you'd describe putting on a coat in cold weather. A practical adaptation to practical circumstances. The forest provided food if you knew which organisms were safe, and how to prepare them. The forest provided shelter if you understood the root network well enough to build within it. The forest even provided protection after a fashion, because the predators that hunted us so relentlessly, the renders and the burrowers and the swarms, left the Rooted alone. They were part of the ecosystem. Recognized, accepted, permitted. But there was a cost. The rooted had not simply learned to live on Vekharra. They had been changed by it. The fungal filaments that grew from their bodies were not decorative. They were functional. Nerve extensions, Nurem would later determine, biological conduits that connected the rooted to the planet's root network the same way the renders were connected. They could feel the forest, sense its moods, detect movement through the ground for hundreds of meters. They knew we had crashed before the fires had stopped burning because the forest told them. They knew how many of us there were because the forest counted our footsteps. They had watched us for 4 weeks, observed our struggles, noted our losses, and waited until they judged we were desperate enough to listen. The young one, Vaitha added, unprompted, and it took me a moment to realize she meant Orit. The one who walked into the trees. The forest was calling him. Some hear it sooner than others. He is with us now. She said it the way you'd say someone had transferred to a different work shift. Routine. I thought about Oret's blank eyes, his dilated pupils, his steady walk into the undergrowth, and I realized that what I'd interpreted as the planet switching him off was actually the planet switching him on. Vaitha explained all of this, standing at our barricade in the blue-green twilight, and as she spoke, I watched the filaments growing from her scalp shift and ripple in patterns that didn't correspond to any breeze. She was communicating with the forest while she talked to us, reporting, or listening to instructions. The distinction was not clear, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. Behind her, the smaller one, the half-changed one who kept watching her, shifted his weight and looked at us with something that wasn't hostility. Curiosity, maybe, or hunger of a different kind. He was close enough to human that I could still read his face, and what I read on it was a person trying to remember whether he had ever stood where we were standing. I would understand that look eventually. I would wear it myself in front of strangers at the edge of a different crash site. Helvane asked the obvious question. What did they want from us? Vaitha tilted her head. The movement was too smooth, too precise, more like a servo mechanism than a human gesture. You are dying here, she said. Every day fewer. The forest is patient. It will take you all. This is what the forest does. She paused. We offer a different path. The different path, as she described it, was simple. Join the rooted, come to the overgrowth, learn to eat what the forest provided, learn to live within its systems, learn to listen to its rhythms. In return, the forest would stop trying to kill us. Not because it was generous, because we would no longer be intruders. We would be part of it. Helvane asked what joining involved, specifically. Vaitha reached up and plucked one of the fungal filaments from her own scalp, a casual gesture that made Nurem wince, and held it out. You eat, she said. The forest enters you. You enter the forest. It takes time. It takes pain. But then you are rooted, and the forest knows you, and you know the forest, and you do not die here. Nobody said anything for a long time. Helvane refused. Of course he refused. The modification Vaitha described was, by any standard, a form of biological corruption. Unsanctioned mutation. The kind of thing the Imperium burned worlds for. He told Vaitha, politely by his standards, that her people were abominations, that the Emperor's faithful did not compromise their humanity to survive, and that she and her kind should leave before he opened fire. Vaitha received this with the same calm she seemed to bring to everything. She said, You will change your thinking. The forest is patient. So are we. Then she and the rooted withdrew into the trees, and within seconds they were gone, swallowed by the gloom as if they'd never been there. There was a long silence around the barricade after they left. Then Cressel spat on the ground and said, Mutants! and that was supposed to be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the next 5 days, 4 things happened that changed the calculus. First, the render attacks resumed with a ferocity we hadn't seen before. Not 2 or 4 creatures, but a dozen, 20, hitting the barricades from every direction simultaneously, breaching in 2 places, killing 7 people before they were driven back. The renders had always been testing our defenses. Now they were dismantling them. Second, root lung began to spread. What had been isolated cases became an epidemic. 16 people developing symptoms within 3 days. The fungicidal compound entirely depleted. Nurum watching her patients slowly suffocate as their lungs were converted into something that processed the planet's atmosphere but could no longer process oxygen. Third, Volcast, the astropath, died. Not from root lung, not from a creature. He simply stopped speaking mid-sentence, pressed his hands against his temples, and collapsed. Nurum said the cause was massive cerebral hemorrhage, but Volcast's last coherent words, spoken to no one in particular while staring at a wall with his blind, milky eyes, were, "It's not whispering anymore. It's singing. It knows my name, and it has been singing it since before we landed." Whatever psychic static the planet's substrate generated, it had been growing louder since we arrived, and Volcast's psycho-sensitive mind was the first thing it burned out. He would not be the last. The forest was learning our frequencies. Fourth, our food reserves hit a critical threshold. I told Helvane we had 6 days of nutrient paste remaining at current rations. After that, we would be eating the forest, or we would be eating nothing. Helvane took the news the way he took everything. Flat expression, straight back, hands clasped, the only sign of strain a muscle jumping in his jaw. He looked at me and said, "Recommendations, stowage-master." I told him I didn't have any. I wasn't a tactician. I was a man who counted things, and the count was bad. The laborers broke first. I should have seen it coming. In the days after Vath's visit, Fenevar's people had changed. Not physically, not yet, but in small behavioral ways that I only recognized in hindsight. They slept with their heads against the hull, close to the outer walls where the root network pressed against the metal. Several of them reported vivid dreams about walking through the forest without fear, about the trees parting for them, about a warmth rising from the ground that felt like a welcome. One of them told me she'd woken with the taste of something sweet in her mouth, though she hadn't eaten. The forest wasn't just waiting for them to choose, it was recruiting. On the 33rd day, Fenevar and a group of about 20 of them went over the barricade during the night and walked into the forest. Not wandering, not confused, not taken the way Orit had been taken. Deliberate. They'd been receiving the forest's invitation for days, and they'd come to a conclusion that Helvane's authority and Cressel's fists and the armsmen's lasguns could no longer override. They would rather answer the call than die slowly behind a barricade that was failing. Helvane could have ordered the armsmen to fire on them. He considered it. I watched him consider it, watched the decision move across his face like weather. Then he lowered his hand and let them go. Not out of mercy. Out of mathematics. 20 fewer mouths extended our food by 2 days, and 20 fewer bodies behind the barricade meant fewer people to protect. The calculus of command on a death world is ugly, but it is calculus, and I understood it better than most because it was my job. 53 of us remained after the defection. 70 dead since the crash, 20 departed to join the rooted. Helvane, Cressel, 6 armsmen, Nurum, Gammis Rodelvex, myself, and 42 crew members in varying states of health, morale, and willingness to continue following orders. The perimeter had been contracted twice. We now occupied a single sealed section of the wreck, surrounded on all sides by a forest that was closing in with visible speed. It was at this point that Gammis Rodelvex finally emerged from his cogitator den and asked to speak with Helvane in private. I was not invited to that conversation, but the Meriddan's Oath was not a large ship, and the section we occupied was not a large space, and the walls between the warrant lieutenant's quarters and the adjacent compartment where I managed the supplies were thin. Thin enough. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but I also did not leave when I heard Helvane begin to speak, because what he said told me that the seed I'd planted about Gammis's navigation obsession had taken root. Helvane confronted Gammis directly. He told the engine seer that he'd reviewed the data core recovery logs, which listed every file Gammis had accessed over the past 4 weeks. Not engineering schematics, not atmospheric data, navigation records, course amendment archives, classified astropathic communication logs. You haven't been trying to figure out what went wrong with our transit, Helvane said. You've known what went wrong since before we crashed. The Meriddan's Oath had not crashed on Vekharra by accident. The ship's navigator, a woman named Ostraka, who had died in the crash, had received a course amendment 14 hours before we dropped out of the warp. The amendment had been transmitted to her directly via a secure astro-telepathic channel, bypassing the ship's captain, bypassing normal fleet communications, and it had instructed her to adjust the ship's warp heading by a fraction of a degree. A tiny change. Insignificant on any normal transit, a course correction like 100 others she'd executed without a second thought. But the adjustment had brought the Meriddan's Oath's real space emergence point from deep void, where it should have been, to the orbital path of Vekharra. The navigator hadn't made an error. She'd followed orders. The orders had come from a Mechanicus astropathic relay station. Gammis didn't name which one. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. Someone within the Adeptus Mechanicus had deliberately diverted a bulk transport with over 2,000 people aboard to a planet that had been erased from the charts 3 centuries ago. The diversion hadn't been intended to crash the ship. It was supposed to bring us close enough for a shuttle to be dispatched to the surface, a quiet insertion under cover of a routine transit, and then the ship would have continued on its way, and no one would have noticed the brief course deviation. But Vekharra's gravitational and electromagnetic anomalies had done what they always did to ships that came too close. They reached out and pulled us down. Helvane listened to this in silence. Then he asked the question that I was screaming in my head. Why? Why would the Mechanicus crash a bulk transport? Gammis did not volunteer the answer. He calculated it. I could hear the pause, the brief silence of a machine weighing whether the truth served his operational needs better than a lie. It did, because he needed Helvane's armed escort to reach the facility, and Helvane was not a man who moved on incomplete data. Because the mineral deposits that Explorator Fleet Rho Tessera 114 was sent to survey 300 years ago were found. They were substantial. They were valuable beyond calculation. And the project to extract them encountered difficulties that the Mechanicus could not resolve, and rather than admit failure, they sealed the records and abandoned the workforce. I was sent to retrieve the survey data, the detailed mineral compositions, the extraction methodology research, the data that was supposedly lost with Fleet Rho Tessera 114, but which the Mechanicus suspected was still stored in the facility's cogitator vaults. That data is worth more than this ship, more than its crew, more than every life lost in this crash. His voice was steady throughout, not because he was brave, but because the part of him that might have felt guilt had been replaced with circuitry decades ago. I regret the unintended consequences of the course correction. He said it the way he might have said he regretted a miscalibrated measurement, the way a machine logs an error code and moves on. I stood on the other side of the wall with my hands pressed flat against the metal and my forehead touching the cold surface, and I breathed in and out very slowly. Unintended consequences. 2,238 dead. A cost-benefit analysis conducted by someone in a Mechanicus archives facility weighed against mineral survey data and found acceptable. I heard Helvane draw his pistol. I heard Gammis say, "If you kill me, Warrant Lieutenant, you lose the only person who can operate the facility's cogitator systems, the only person who can activate its communications array. The facility has a long-range Vox relay hardened against the planet's electromagnetic interference. It is your only hope of rescue." I heard the click of his holster closing. He didn't shoot, because Gammis was right. The engine seer was their only ticket off-world, and Helvane knew it, and Gammis knew Helvane knew it, and that calculation was the only reason Gammis was still generating a heartbeat. He called a general assembly of all remaining survivors, and he told them, in the same flat, clipped military tone he used for everything, that there was a Mechanicus facility approximately 6 kilometers northeast, that it contained a functioning communications array, and that reaching it was now their primary objective. He did not tell them about the course correction. He did not tell them about the Mechanicus cover-up. He did not tell them that the man walking among them with half his face covered in fungal growth and a chunk of the ship's hull embedded in his shoulder was the reason they were here. Because telling them would have started a riot, and a riot would have killed more people than the truth was worth. I watched it cost him. Jareth Helvane had never been a liar. In 5 weeks on Vekharra, I had seen him do hard things, cruel things, things that a different man would have softened or delegated. But he had always done them in the open, with his reasons stated plainly, because that was the only currency he traded in. Now he was standing in front of his people and lying to them by omission, and I could see the price of it in the way his hand gripped his wrist behind his back, knuckles white against dark skin. He was breaking his own spine to keep the rest of us standing. I wondered how long a man could do that before the fracture reached something load-bearing. I kept my mouth shut because on a death world, the man with the plan is the man you follow, even when you know the plan is built on a foundation of lies. We left the wreck of the Meriddan's oath on the 35th day. 51 survivors, down 2 more to Root Lung overnight. We carried what we could, weapons, water, the last of the nutrient paste, Nurem's Medici supplies, and Gammis's portable cogitator interface that he said he'd need to access the facility's systems. The rest we left behind. 4 weeks of salvage work, barricade construction, desperate fortification, abandoned in a single morning. The forest was already growing through the hull when we walked away. By the time we reached the tree line and looked back, the first fungal filaments were threading through the bridge viewports like fingers reaching for something left behind in the dark. We followed the stone markers northeast. The forest changed as we moved deeper. The fungal trees grew taller, their trunks wider, their canopy thicker. The twilight deepened into near darkness. The bioluminescence increased to compensate, casting everything in a blue-green glow that played tricks with depth perception and made every shadow look like something crouching. The air grew thicker, wetter, heavier with spores that made your eyes water and your nose run. Nurem distributed strips of cloth soaked in her last remaining fungicidal compound to use as breathing filters, warning us that they would be effective for approximately 4 hours before the compound degraded. After that, she said, we'd be breathing unfiltered Vekharra. She did not elaborate on what unfiltered Vekharra would do to our lungs. She was a better doctor than storyteller. We moved in single file, armsmen at front and rear, the civilians in between, Gammis at the center of the column because he was the most valuable person in the group, and everyone knew it and nobody liked it. The stone markers appeared every 100 meters or so, half buried in root, glowing faintly with colonized luminescent fungus, pointing the way toward a facility that 300 years of forest had buried but not entirely consumed. The renders didn't attack us during the march. Nothing did. The forest was quiet in that way that I had learned to distrust. Nuram walked beside me for a stretch and said, "They're watching." I asked who. She said, "All of it." I didn't ask her to clarify. We spotted the first of the rooted about 2 kilometers into the march. A figure standing motionless between two trunks, gray-green skin blending with the bark, amber eyes tracking us as we passed. Then another, then more. They flanked our column on both sides, visible when the lumen light caught their eyes, invisible when it didn't, maintaining a distance of about 50 meters and matching our pace without apparent effort. They didn't approach. They didn't threaten. They watched. Helvain kept the column moving. He had the look of a man who had committed to a course of action and would follow it until it killed him or succeeded, and the difference between the two outcomes was something he'd stopped worrying about. Kressel walked at his shoulder with a lasgun in his hands and an expression on his face that suggested he was looking forward to shooting something, anything, as long as it stopped the walking. 4 hours in, we reached the outer perimeter of the old Mechanicus installation. And when I say outer perimeter, I mean we walked into it before we realized it was there. The facility had not been built on the surface. It had been built into the root network. The Mechanicus engineers who'd designed it 3 centuries ago had understood that building on Vekharra's surface was an exercise in futility. So they'd gone down, into the root system, into the living infrastructure of the planet itself. The surface structures we'd found during our scouting, the foundations and collapsed walls, had been ancillary buildings, storage, landing pads, surface operations. The real facility was underground, accessed through shafts that descended into the root network. And the root network had grown around and through it over 3 centuries until the distinction between building and biology was impossible to determine. Gammis led us to what he said was the primary access shaft, a circular opening in the ground about 3 meters across, ringed with corroded metal that might once have been a reinforced frame, now integrated so thoroughly into the surrounding root system that it looked like a mouth, a throat descending into darkness with walls of interwoven root and ancient metal. The air rising from it was warm and wet and smelled of deep earth and old machine oil and something organic that I couldn't identify and didn't want to. Helvain looked down the shaft. He looked at Gammis. He said, "You're sure the Vox relay is down there?" Gammis said yes. Helvain said, "Then we go down." I noticed he did not say, "Then we come back up." He posted 4 armsmen at the shaft entrance to watch the rooted, assigned the remaining 2 to lead the column, and we descended. 51 people climbing into the gullet of a death world, following a man who had already killed 2,000 of their shipmates, and a plan built on information provided by the person responsible. I went down with the rest, not because I trusted the plan, not because I believed in rescue, because there was nowhere else to go. Behind us was a forest that would digest us. Above us was a sky we couldn't reach. Below us was the only option left, and on Vekharra, options were the rarest resource of all. The descent took longer than it should have. The shaft went down 30 meters, which isn't much, except when the walls are alive. The root network had grown through and around the original metal structure of the shaft, creating a surface that was half corroded steel and half dense, fibrous organic material, slick with moisture and crawling with small organisms that scattered from our lumen light. We climbed down using whatever handholds offered themselves, metal rungs where they hadn't rusted away, root protrusions where they had, and the deeper we went, the warmer and wetter the air became until it felt like descending into the lung of something enormous. The bioluminescence increased as we went down, shifting from blue-green to a deeper amber that pulsed in slow rhythms, and I realized with a lurch in my stomach that the pulses matched the heartbeat I'd noticed in Vathor's luminescent veins. The same rhythm, the same source, the planet's circulatory system visible in the walls, and we were climbing down through it. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a corridor, wide enough for 3 people abreast, high enough to stand upright, and built with the functional brutalism that characterizes Mechanicus architecture everywhere in the Imperium. Metal walls, metal floor, metal ceiling, all of it corroded and colonized, but still structurally intact. The Mechanicus build to last. Even 3 centuries of Death World biology hadn't managed to do more than superficial damage to the main structure. The roots had penetrated the walls in places, threading through cracks and seams and failed seals, and the fungal bioluminescence had colonized every surface, giving the corridor the appearance of something that had been beautiful once and was now being slowly eaten from the inside out. Gammis took the lead. He moved through the corridors with a confidence that I found deeply unsettling, because it implied a familiarity with the layout that he should not have had. When I asked him how he knew the way, he said the facility's schematic had been stored in the Meriddan's Oaths classified databanks, one of the documents that proved the Mechanicus had not, in fact, lost all records of this place. They'd simply moved the records to a classification level where only those who needed to know could access them. And Gammis had been one of those people. He'd had the layout memorized before we ever left port. That knowledge that he'd walked onto our ship knowing where it was going and what he'd find there settled into my chest like a cold stone. The facility was larger than the surface ruins had suggested. Much larger. It extended in multiple directions from the central shaft, a network of corridors and chambers and laboratories and storage vaults, all of it underground, all of it built within, and now thoroughly integrated into the root network. As we moved deeper, the roots became more prevalent, the metal less so, until in some sections the distinction disappeared entirely and we were walking through tunnels that were as much organic as engineered. The air smelled of earth and decay and the sharp chemical tang of old machine fluids that had leaked and been absorbed by the root system over centuries. In places, the roots had formed structures of their own, archways and buttresses and columns that mimicked the architecture they'd consumed, as if the forest had studied what the Mechanicus had built and decided to continue the project in its own medium. We found the first bodies about 400 meters in, not recent, old. Centuries old, skeletons in the remains of Mechanicus robes, tech priest vestments that had rotted to scraps, the augmetics that had replaced their flesh, corroded but still recognizable. They were scattered throughout a large chamber that had once been, based on the equipment bolted to the walls, a primary laboratory. Workbenches, analysis equipment, storage racks, all of it ancient, much of it broken, some of it still faintly humming with power drawn from sources I couldn't see, and among the benches and equipment, the dead. At least 30 of them, sprawled where they'd fallen, no wounds visible, no signs of violence. They had simply died, sat down at their workstations or collapsed in the corridors and stopped living. Nurem examined several of them while Helvane held the column at the chamber's entrance. She reported that the skeletal remains showed extensive fungal colonization, the bones threaded through with filaments the way the living rooted were threaded through with filaments, but far more advanced. The organisms had penetrated not just the bones but the augmetics as well, growing through circuits and gears and data conduits, integrating the mechanical components into the biological network. These people had been rooted, or had been in the process of becoming rooted, and something about the process had killed them. Gammis studied the dead tech priests with his augmetic eye, cycling through spectra, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "These are the senior research staff of the installation, organicists, a sect that holds biological ascension equal to the machine, flesh perfected rather than replaced. On a forge world, they are tolerated, even useful. Amigos who can graft a laboratory-grown gland is worth keeping. But these ones went past what tolerance allows. They did not enhance themselves with vat-grown organs of their own design. They tried to marry their bodies to something that grew wild on a Xenos world, something they did not make and could not control. That is not ascension. That is surrender to the alien, and the Mechanicus does not forgive it. They remained when the workforce was abandoned. They continued the project." I asked what project. He told me, and Nurem filled in the parts his Mechanicus vocabulary couldn't make human. The mineral that explorator fleet Rho Tessera 114 had been sent to survey was not, as I had assumed, some exotic ore or rare earth element. It was biological. A subsurface organism existing throughout the planet's crust, functioning as the base layer of Vekharra's entire ecosystem. "It's not tyrannide," Nurem said, before I could ask the question that every Imperial citizen learns to ask when confronted with something that eats and grows and spreads. Every Navy Medici drills on Xenos threat recognition. You learn to spot the signatures that mean run before you learn to set a bone. There's no hive signature, no synapse architecture, no external mind directing it. And it isn't chaos either. Nothing here touches the warp except as noise. This thing grew here in the dark, alone, for longer than our species has had language. She turned a skeletal forearm in her hands. The filaments in these bones are 3 times denser than anything I've seen in the rooted on the surface. Whatever this substrate is, these people were saturated with it. Everything on the surface, the fungal trees, the renders, the swarms, the root network, all of it grew from this substrate the way a plant grows from soil. The organism was old, older than the Imperium. The Mechanicus researchers had classified it as a macroorganism of unknown origin, a living mineral that blurred the line between geology and biology, and their initial surveys had indicated that its properties could revolutionize biological engineering, pharmacological production, and possibly even the maintenance of cybernetic augmetics. The planet itself was the prize. A living resource of incalculable value, growing beneath the surface of a world that the Imperium had written off and forgotten. The senior research staff had stayed behind when the workforce was abandoned. The workforce, several hundred menial laborers and their families, had been left on the surface when the Mechanicus pulled out. The researchers, unwilling to leave their work, had sealed themselves underground and continued their experiments. They had studied the substrate. They had attempted to cultivate it. They had experimented with integrating it into their own augmetics, trying to create a symbiosis between human and planet that would allow them to harness its properties. The dead tech priests around us were the result. The integration had worked up to a point. They had connected themselves to the substrate, felt its rhythms, accessed its data in ways that their cogitators could not. And then the substrate had consumed them. It had grown through their augmetics, through their bones, through their neural pathways, and it had replaced what it found with itself. They hadn't died of disease or injury. They had died of success. "Look at this," Nurem said quietly, pointing at where a tech priest's augmetic hand merged seamlessly into the root-threaded floor. "You can't tell where the machine ends and the planet begins." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a case in the Medici archives, centuries old. A Magos biologist found Imperial ships drifting empty in the void, crews dead in their bunks, fungal growth threaded through their skulls. He wrote it up as a Xenos plague and had the hulls burned. I always assumed he'd found some drifting spore cloud." She looked at the dead around us. "He found a ship that had passed too close to a world like this one. He was wrong about the plague. It was never a disease. It was an invitation nobody answered in time. Their experiment had worked perfectly. The result was that they stopped being human and became part of the floor. Above us, on the surface, the abandoned workforce had undergone the same process, but slowly, generationally, without the direct augmetic interface that had killed the researchers. They'd eaten the forest had eaten them back. Over 300 years, the exchange had reached an equilibrium. The rooted, not dead, not consumed, but changed, integrated at a pace that allowed survival. Vekharra and the rooted were waiting for us at the facility's central hub. I don't know how they got there ahead of us. There must have been other access points, routes through the root network that the rooted knew and we didn't. But when Gammis led us into the hub, a massive circular chamber with a domed ceiling and the remains of what had been the facility's primary cogitator array, the rooted were there. Dozens of them, standing in the amber bioluminescent glow, their gray-green skin reflecting the light, their amber eyes watching us with that terrible human intelligence. Vekharra stood at the center of the chamber, beside a structure that rose from the floor to the ceiling like a pillar. But it wasn't a pillar. It was a growth, a column of the substrate itself, rising from the deep rock below, glowing with an amber light that made everything in the chamber look like it was underwater. The roots that threaded through the walls and ceiling all traced back to this column. The bioluminescence pulsed from it. The warmth radiated from it. This was the heart, not of the facility, of the planet, or at least a node of whatever vast network lay beneath the surface. Vekharra looked at us with something that might have been pity and might have been hunger. It was hard to tell with a face that had been reshaped by 300 years of evolutionary pressure. "You found the metal ones," she said, looking at the dead tech priests scattered around the chamber's edges. "They tried to take what the forest gives. They broke themselves against it." She placed her hand on the glowing column. The filaments growing from her arm reached for it, connected, and for a moment the entire chamber's bioluminescence brightened, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "The forest gives to those who ask, not to those who take." Helvain raised his last pistol. "Stand aside," he said. "We need the communications array." Vekharra didn't move. "Your machine speaker wants more than communications. He wants what the metal ones wanted. He wants to take." Her amber eyes shifted to Gammis Rodelvex. "I can hear what his machines whisper to each other. The forest hears everything." Gammis said nothing, but I noticed his augmetic eye shift fractionally toward the northern corridor, the direction of the facility's deeper chambers, and the movement told me everything his silence didn't. He knew this place. He'd known it long before we arrived. Helvane repeated his demand. Vaetha repeated her position. The rooted shifted in the shadows, their sharpened fungal wood weapons catching the amber light. The armsmen raised their lasguns, and for a long, terrible moment, the chamber was balanced on the edge of violence. 51 exhausted survivors with energy weapons facing 40-plus post-human natives with spears, in a room at the heart of a dead Mechanicus facility, at the bottom of a shaft on a planet that wanted all of them dead. It was Fenevar who broke the impasse. I hadn't noticed him among the rooted, but there he was, the cargo handler who'd led the defection 8 days earlier. He'd changed. Not dramatically, not in 8 days, but the early signs were there. A discoloration of the skin around his neck and hands, a slight widening of the pupils, a faint tracery of filaments visible at his temples. The forest was entering him. He was entering the forest. He stepped forward from the rooted and addressed Helvane directly. "She's not lying, Lieutenant. They'll let you use the Vox." "They don't care about the Vox. It's the other thing they won't allow." He looked at Gammis. "The data, the survey records, the research. Whatever he came here to steal, the forest won't let it leave." Helvane looked at Gammis. "Is the Vox relay all you need?" Gammis was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "The Vox relay is sufficient to summon retrieval." Helvane looked at Vaetha. "We access the communications equipment. Nothing else. We send a signal. Then we leave." Vaetha considered this. The filaments at her hand pulsed against the column, and I had the overwhelming sense that she was conferring with something, consulting an intelligence that was not hers alone. Then she withdrew her hand and stepped aside. "The speaking machine is in the northern chamber. Your machine speaker may wake it, but only the speaking machine. If he touches the memory vaults, the forest will know, and the forest will answer." Gammis moved toward the northern corridor without waiting for Helvane's order. The engineer's remaining organic eye was fixed ahead with an intensity that I recognized. I'd seen it in dock workers who'd spent a long shift and could see the end of their watch, single-minded, focused on the finish, incapable of seeing anything else. I followed him, not because Helvane ordered me to, because something in my gut, the part that had spent 4 years calculating weight distributions and center of mass variances and knowing when a load was about to shift, told me that the balance was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. And when the numbers don't add up, a stowage-master goes to check the cargo personally. The northern chamber was smaller than the hub. A communications room, clearly, with the remains of a long-range Vox array bolted to one wall, its components corroded but intact, its power supply connected to the same deep earth sources that kept the facility's lights burning after 3 centuries. Beside the Vox array, separated by a partition that was now more root than metal, was another console, larger, more complex, connected to a series of data storage units that were embedded in the walls, their surfaces crawling with fungal growth, but their indicator lights still faintly glowing. The memory vaults, the survey data, everything Gammis Rho Delvex had crashed a ship to reach. Gammis went to the Vox array first. He connected his portable cogitator interface, his fingers moving with the precise inhuman speed of augmetic motor control, and within minutes the array hummed to life. Lights flickered, static crackled. The interference that had crippled our surface Voxcasters was, as he'd predicted, unable to penetrate this deep into the facility. The array was shielded, hardened, built to punch a signal through Vekharra's electromagnetic soup. It worked. Gammis composed a message, a distress signal, formatted in Mechanicus communication protocols, encrypted, transmitted on a frequency that I didn't recognize. Standard Navy distress frequencies would have reached any Imperial vessel in the subsector. This was not a standard frequency. This was a Mechanicus-specific channel, the kind used for classified operations, the kind that would be received only by someone who was listening for it. I said, "Who are you calling?" He didn't answer. I said it again, louder. He turned to me, and in the amber bioluminescent glow of the chamber, with half his face covered in fungal growth and his augmetic eye spinning through data frequencies, he looked like something that had stopped being human a long time ago. Not like the rooted, who had been changed by biology, like something that had been changed by purpose. "A recovery team," he said. "Adeptus Mechanicus. They have been on standby since before we left port. They are within 2 warp jumps of this location." He paused, and the pause was itself information. "They will not wait indefinitely. If no signal reaches them within a set window, the operation is written off, as the First Fleet was written off, and this world returns to the dark. The Mechanicus does not chase sunk investments. It buries them." I let that sink in. A recovery team on standby, waiting for his signal, waiting for him to reach this facility, access this array, and call them in. The entire operation, from the course correction to the crash, to the 4 weeks of death and survival that had brought us here, had been planned. Not the crash, specifically, but the contingency. Gammis had been prepared for every possible outcome of the diversion. If the ship had passed safely, he'd have taken a shuttle down. When the ship crashed, he'd adapted. He'd used us, the survivors, as labor and protection, guiding us toward the facility under the guise of seeking rescue, letting us die to the forest in whatever numbers Vekharra demanded, as long as enough survived to get him where he needed to go. I looked at the memory vaults. Their indicator lights glowed softly behind the partition. "You're not just calling for rescue," I said. Gammis turned back to his console. "The recovery team will extract the data, the survey personnel, and any surviving crew. Standard Mechanicus protocol. Standard Mechanicus protocol for a classified operation that's been erased from official records for 3 centuries." He said nothing. "What happens to us, the survivors, the witnesses?" His fingers paused on the console. A micro-hesitation. Less than a second. But I'd spent 4 years watching cargo loaders, reading their body language for signs of fatigue or inattention that could cause accidents, and I knew what a tell looked like. A tech priest's hands never stop moving when they're connected to a functioning console. It's like breathing. Involuntary. His had stopped because he was concentrating on something else. On constructing a story that would sound plausible long enough for the recovery team to arrive. "You will be debriefed," he said, "reassigned. The details of this operation are classified, and you will be required to sign non-disclosure documentation under Mechanicus authority." I didn't need him to finish. I could see the shape of it in the silence between his words. Classified operation, erased records, a planet full of evidence that the Mechanicus had abandoned hundreds of its own workers to mutation and death, survivors who'd seen too much, witnesses who could never be allowed to report what they'd found. I'd heard how the Imperium handled utmost secret work. The bulk of a crew was simply executed when the mission ended, quietly, efficiently, no different from decommissioning equipment. The valuable few, a skilled chirurgeon, perhaps, or a man who'd proven useful, might be spared the bolt and given the mind scrub instead, walking away hollow, remembering nothing. Neither option was survival. One took your life, and one took the part of you that made a life worth having. The recovery team wouldn't debrief us. They'd silence us one way or the other, the same way they'd silenced the records of Explorator Fleet Row Tessera 114, the same way they'd silenced the existence of Vekharra itself. We were dead the moment that signal was sent. We just didn't know it yet. Except that now I did. I didn't make a decision in that moment. Decisions imply deliberation, and there wasn't time for that. What happened was simpler. I looked at the Vox array with its signal already broadcasting into the void, and I looked at Gammus Rho Delvex standing at the console with his augmetic fingers poised over the controls, and I looked at the memory vault behind the partition with its 300-year-old secrets glowing in the dark, and a number appeared in my head. The way numbers always appeared in my head, unbidden, automatic. The product of a mind that had been trained to calculate load tolerances and margin deficits. The number was 51. 51 people who were going to die because a Mechanicus engine seer valued mineral data above human lives. And the number that I weighed against it was one. One signal relay, one machine, one thing that could be broken. I picked up the heaviest object within reach, a corroded section of piping that had fallen from the ceiling, and I hit the Vox array as hard as I could. Gammus was fast, augmetic reflexes, inhuman reaction time. He caught my second swing with his mechadendrite, the flexible mechanical appendage that extended from the housing unit on his spine, and he wrenched the pipe from my hands with a force that sent me staggering. But the first blow had done its work. The array's primary transmission coil was shattered, ceramic components scattered across the floor, and the signal that had been broadcasting into the void cut off mid-pulse. The message had been transmitting for approximately 90 seconds. I had no idea how much of it had been received. Maybe all of it. Maybe enough. Maybe not enough to matter. Gammus looked at the ruined array and then at me. His augmetic eye was burning a steady red, the anger that his vocal modulator could not express, written in the light of a mechanical iris. "You have killed us all," he said. "You killed us all when you diverted the ship." He moved toward me, not with the stiff, mechanical gait I'd seen from him over the past 5 weeks, but with a fluid, predatory speed that told me his augmetics were far more extensive than he'd let anyone believe. Legs, arms, spine, all of them upgraded for speed and strength that no cargo ship enginseer would ever need. He was not a cargo ship enginseer. He was something else, something the Mechanicus had built for a purpose, and that purpose was standing between me and the door with ceramic-reinforced fingers that could crush bone. Helvane appeared in the doorway behind Gammus with his last pistol drawn. He must have followed Gammus from the hub. Of course he had. I'd planted the suspicion about the navigation data weeks ago, and Jareth Helvane was not a man who forgot a discrepancy. He'd let Gammus walk ahead, let the engine seer show his hand. Now he was standing in the frame with his weapon up and his eyes doing the same cold arithmetic they always did. "Stand down, enginseer." The warrant lieutenant's voice was the same flat, steady tone it always was, but there was something behind it that I hadn't heard before. Finality. The sound of a man who had made his last decision. Gammus turned. "The signal has been interrupted. Without it, no recovery team will come. Without the recovery team, there is no rescue." "I heard enough," Helvane said. "I didn't trust him on the oath. I don't trust him here." He raised the last pistol and sighted along it. "There was never going to be a rescue. Not for us." The shot took Gammus in the center of his chest. The enginseer staggered but didn't fall. Augmetic reinforcement, subdermal plating, Whatever hardware he'd been hiding under his robes, it absorbed the last bolt and converted the energy into heat that I could feel from 3 meters away. Gammis lunged at Helvain, his mechadendrite whipped forward, catching the warrant lieutenant across the temple with a crack that I heard through the walls. Helvain went down. Gammis bent over him, fingers reaching for his throat. I hit Gammis from behind with a chunk of the ruined Vox array, a ceramic housing unit with sharp edges and enough weight to matter. The blow connected at the junction of his neck and shoulder, where the bulkhead fragment was still embedded. And something inside him failed. A shower of sparks, a sound like tearing fabric. His mechadendrite spasmed and went rigid, and Gammis stumbled sideways and hit the wall and slid to the ground with his augmetic eye flickering between red and dark. He was still alive, still conscious. His organic eye found mine. "The data," he said. His voice was distorted, the Vox synthesizer damaged, words coming out in fragments and static. "The substrate research. It is worth more than you can comprehend. Worlds could be transformed. Billions of lives. You are destroying progress for the sake of 50. I looked at him, sitting against the wall with his machines breaking down around him and the forest growing through his augmetics, and something shifted in my chest. The man in front of me didn't see people in the equation, just variables, just cargo. I've spent my whole career being told that the load matters more than the loader, I said, that the cargo is what counts, that the men who carry it are replaceable. You know what I've learned about that? It's true. The cargo does matter more than the loader. But you don't get to decide what the cargo is. Helvain was unconscious but breathing. Kressel and the armsmen arrived moments later, drawn by the sound of the last shot. They found me standing over a disabled Enginseer with blood on my hands and their commanding officer on the floor, and for a very uncomfortable 30 seconds, I thought they were going to shoot me. Kressel looked at the scene, looked at the ruined Voxgate array, looked at Gammis twitching against the wall with sparks arcing from his exposed augmetics and said, "Someone want to tell me what in the throne's name is going on?" I told him. All of it. The course correction, the Mechanicus cover-up, the recovery team, what Gammis had intended for us. I told it the way I tell everything, in numbers, in facts, in the cold language of manifests and inventories. How many died, how many were left, what the odds were. Kressel was not a complicated man, but he understood logistics the way all career deckhands understand logistics. He understood what it meant when the manifest didn't add up. When I was finished, he looked at Gammis and said, "So we're stranded." "We were always stranded," I said. The only question was whether we were going to die knowing why or die confused. Kressel considered this. Then he said, "Right, let's get the lieutenant up." They carried Helvain out. Gammis they left. Not deliberately, not by order. He was too heavy with his augmetics to carry easily, and nobody volunteered. And there was a long moment where we all stood in the corridor and looked at each other and understood that leaving a wounded man in the dark was something we were doing and would have to live with. Then Nurem, who had been quiet through all of it, went back in and stabilized him with a neural suppressant that shut down his remaining augmetic functions and left him unconscious. She did it because she was a chirurgion, and chirurgions don't leave patients to die, even the patients who deserve it. When she came out, she looked at me with a particular expression that I'd seen on her face before, the look she wore when a medical finding disgusted her on a professional level. "He's more machine than he showed us," she said. "The robes hid it. Subdermal plating across the entire torso. Reinforced skeletal structure. Combat-grade augmetics. That man was never a shipboard engineer. He's a Mechanicus operative, purpose-built for fieldwork in hostile environments." She paused. "I should have pushed harder to examine him after the crash. He wouldn't let me near anything below the neck. Now I know why." We brought Gammis back to the central hub. The rooted were still there. Vaitha was still standing beside the glowing column with her hand connected to the substrate, and when we emerged with a ruined engineer and an unconscious warrant lieutenant and a stowage-master who was bleeding from a dozen small cuts and shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline, she regarded us with the same patient, amber-eyed calm that she regarded everything. "Your machine speaker tried to take," she said. It was not a question. "He did. And you stopped him." "I stopped the signal. I don't know if it was in time." Vaitha tilted her head. The forest heard the machine voice. Brief, broken, perhaps heard, perhaps not, by those it was meant for. She paused. "The forest does not know if they will come." Neither did I. If the signal had reached them, they'd come and bring a cleanup operation, not salvation. If it hadn't, we'd never leave. Either option ended the same way. We were staying. Helvane woke up 6 hours later with a concussion and a mood that made his previous disposition look cheerful. When he'd been briefed on everything that had happened, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the glowing column at the center of the hub with an expression that I couldn't read. Then he said, "How many do we have?" I told him. 49, including him. 2 people had succumbed to root lung during the descent. 49 souls, no supplies, no ship, no rescue, 6 kilometers underground on a death world. He looked at Vaitha. "Your offer, from before, it still stands?" Vaitha's hand pulsed against the column. The entire chamber brightened for a heartbeat. "The forest does not withdraw its invitations." Helvane turned to the survivors. All of them. Armsmen and laborers and crew, the distinctions that had meant so much on the surface, suddenly irrelevant in the amber glow of the planet's heart. He told them the truth, all of it. The crash, Gammis, the recovery team, the options. He told them the way he told everything, in clipped, precise sentences, without softening or editorializing, because Jareth Helvane was many things, but he had never been a liar. He told them that they could try to return to the surface and survive on their own, which would last days at best. Or they could accept Vaitha's offer and become part of Vekharra and live. He did not tell them which option he recommended. He didn't need to. The mathematics spoke for themselves. I stood at the edge of the group and I felt it. The thing Fenevar's people had described, the thing that had taken Ort, the thing that had killed Volkhast because his mind was too open and the song was too loud. A warmth rising through the floor of the chamber, through my boots, through the soles of my feet, into my bones. I looked down and saw the filaments in the floor reaching for the edges of my boots, thin as hair, slow as growing things, tasting the leather the way the forest tasted everything. Not a temperature, a presence. The substrate beneath us, the living foundation of the entire planet, aware of every heartbeat in the room. The same transaction it had offered every organism that had ever set foot on Vekharra since the beginning. Become part of me, and I will let you live. I ate the first of the forest's gifts that night, a segment of dense fungal matter that Vaitha cut from the base of the glowing column and placed in my hand like a communion wafer. It tasted like nothing I can compare to anything in human experience. It hurt. Vaitha hadn't lied about that. 3 weeks of fever and cramping, and a sensation like my entire nervous system was being rewired, which is exactly what was happening. My skin changed first. the pigmentation shifting to the gray-green that let the rooted blend with the forest. Then my eyes, the pupils widening, the irises thinning, everything adjusting for life under the canopy's perpetual twilight. Then the deeper changes, the ones you feel rather than see, the root networks whisper in your bones, the pulse of the substrate beneath your feet. The awareness of every living thing within 100 meters felt through the ground like vibrations through a ship's hull. I am still me. I want to be clear about that. My name is Orbeck Traves. I was stowage-master aboard the Meriddan's Oath. I can still count. I can still calculate. I can still tell you the weight tolerance of a Goliath-class cargo bay and the optimal distribution pattern for compressed nutrient paste. The forest didn't take those things. It took other things. It took the cold. I don't feel temperature anymore, not the way I used to. It took the need for cooked food, for filtered water, for walls between me and the dark. It took the feeling of being separate from the ground I walk on. That last one is hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. Imagine spending your whole life in a sealed compartment, recycled air, metal walls, and then one day the walls dissolve and you realize the compartment was inside something alive, and it was alive the whole time and it knew you were there. 31 of us accepted. 18 refused. Of the 18, 6 tried to return to the surface. Helvane was one of them. He came to me before he left, which surprised me, because Jareth Helvane was not a man who said goodbye. He stood in front of me with his last pistol holstered and his uniform filthy and his regulation scar half hidden by 3 days of stubble, and he looked at me the way he'd looked at the forest on that first night. Not with fear, with the flat recognition of a man who has assessed a situation and found it unacceptable. "You're making the wrong choice, Traves," he said. Not angry, not pleading, just stating it the way he stated everything. A fact among facts. I told him I was making the only choice the numbers supported. He almost smiled. Almost. The closest I'd ever seen him get. "The numbers," he said. "You and your numbers. The Imperium isn't built on numbers, stowage-master. It's built on what men refuse to become." Then he turned and walked toward the access shaft, back straight, stride even, and Kressel fell in at his shoulder without a word, the way he'd been falling in at Helvane's shoulder for 15 years. 4 other survivors followed. They climbed out of the facility and walked into the forest, and the forest took them within a day. The Renders found Helvane before nightfall. I know because the root network told me. I felt the impact through the ground, felt the brief, violent reshuffling of biomass, and then nothing. He died the way he lived, straight-backed, following orders that no one had given him except himself. The remaining 12 stayed in the facility, refused the forest, and died of root lung within 2 months. They died human. I suppose that was their choice. Nurem accepted. She said, "I'm a doctor. My job is to keep people alive. I can't do that if I'm dead." Practical to the last, she's still here, still treating injuries and illnesses, though the injuries are different now and the illnesses are ones that no Imperial Medici handbook covers. Gamis Ro Delvex is still alive, technically. The rooted keep him in one of the lower chambers, disconnected from his augmetics, which the root network has almost entirely consumed. He stares at the ceiling and sometimes speaks in binary cant, and the substrate hums around him like it's listening. Vaitha says the forest is learning from his machines, taking what it needs. The Mechanicus came to study Vekharra. In the end, Vekharra studied them. I tend the perimeter markers now, the skulls. I understand them better than I used to. They're not warnings. They're records. Each one is a person who was rooted and died, and whose bones the forest preserved as a memorial, a manifest, a count of the dead. I appreciate that. A stowage-master always appreciates a good manifest. I know what you're expecting now. The rescue, the escape, the Imperial Navy arriving in a blaze of macro cannon fire to pull the survivors out and restore the natural order of things. That's how the stories go in the port cantinas, isn't it? Someone always comes. The Imperium always remembers its own. Let me tell you what I've learned about that particular lie, and why I've told you all of this. 4 days ago, the forest told us something was coming, a disturbance in the upper atmosphere, a ship falling. It has been 8 months, and Gammas told me the Mechanicus does not wait indefinitely, that after a set silence they write the operation off and let the world go back to the dark. So this is almost certainly not the recovery team. Vekharra's gravitational anomalies pulled us down. They pulled down Explorator Fleet Rotasera 114 3 centuries before that. And now they'd pulled down something else. Perhaps the 90 seconds of Gammas's signal reached someone before I shattered the array, and that someone sent a vessel to look, and it made the same mistake we did, coming too close to a planet that reaches up and grabs anything within range. Perhaps it was something unrelated, a ship that stumbled into the wrong stretch of void the way we had, running from its own secrets or its own bad luck. The forest doesn't know the difference, and neither do I. All I know is that something heavy and metal and full of soft, warm, frightened things broke through the canopy and hit the ground. We felt the impact through the root network, felt the trees break and the soil compact, and the ecosystem recoil from the wound the way a body recoils from a cut. We knew the location, we knew the approximate size, we knew because the forest told us that there were survivors. So here I am, standing at the edge of your crash site in the blue-green twilight, with my gray skin and my wide eyes and my filaments waving in air that you find suffocating and I find perfectly comfortable. You're looking at me the way I looked at Vekharra 8 months ago, with fear, with revulsion, with the dawning understanding that the thing in front of you used to be human and isn't quite anymore. I know that look. I wore it myself once, on the other side of this exact conversation. Your ship is gone, your communications don't work, your supplies won't last. The forest is already threading roots through your hull, and by tomorrow the renders will come, and after that the swarms, and after that the root long, and you will die by centimeters in a place that no star chart shows and no rescue mission will reach. Or you eat what the forest gives. You become what the forest needs. You survive, not as what you were, as something else, something with roots. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking there must be another option. There is always another option in the stories, always a third path, a clever escape, a hero's gambit. That is because stories are told by people who survived. Vekharra doesn't negotiate. Vekharra doesn't bargain. Vekharra provides, and in return, Vekharra takes. That is the oldest transaction in the galaxy. Give and take. Cargo in, cargo out. The manifest always balances in the end. My name is Orbeck Traves. I was a stowage-master aboard a ship that no longer exists. And I am telling you this because someone told it to me once, standing where I stand now, and I wish I had listened sooner. The forest is waiting. It's patient. It has time. But you don't.